Great. Well, yeah, no, thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, it's this evening in London, so wherever you are, welcome. And yeah, I'm really delighted to be speaking to Professor Zaretsky about his book that was about the pandemic or born out of the pandemic, and how we might learn some of the lessons that the great thinkers before us have considered around disease and plague. So my first question for you really is, I'd really love to get more of a sense of the fact that you weave this book, which is about philosophy, into a very kind of practical experience, which was that you volunteered for 3 months in the real thick of the pandemic in a dementia care home in Texas. And I'm interested in how, firstly, you managed to, when you were writing the book, relate those real life experiences back to the philosophy and how that kind of came about. Was it when you were actively caring for people? Did you think at the time, oh, this would make a good book? I don't know. What your thought process there would be really interesting.
Well, most of these, most of the people I discuss in the book, Lottie, I've taught, I've written on, I've read and reread. So by and large, they weren't strangers. And when I was asked by a very close friend if I could volunteer at a nearby nursing home, and the reason is that with lockdown in the United States in late March, or in Texas, the nursing home found itself dramatically understaffed and overworked. And, and so they needed help. My friend, who's a physical therapist, asked if I could find the time. And suddenly I had time, in part because the university had closed as well, and everything was now via Zoom. And so, of course, I agreed. And my job at the nursing home was what they call a hospitality volunteer. Since the dining hall at the nursing home was closed, residents were now required to take their meals in their rooms. No gatherings were allowed, of course. One of my jobs, my principal job, was to take their meals, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, to their rooms from the kitchen, and pass out the trays and to help them eat. The majority of the residents were incapable of feeding themselves because of either physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities. And after a few days at the nursing home, I couldn't help but think of ways in which I could understand this experience. It was an experience I had never, I experienced nothing at all similar to what I was doing at the nursing home. Just as the arrival of the novel coronavirus was utterly unprecedented for me as well, and for millions and millions of others. And so I did what I often do when I found myself in a new situation, and a situation that unsteadies me. I turn to thinkers, to writers I've often turned to in the past, for insight, for the way in which they confronted in their lives similar situations. And perhaps most important, I turned to them for company. And so while I was at the nursing home, during breaks, and once I returned home at night, I would turn to Montaigne. I always turn to Montaigne. I would turn to Camus, somebody else I often turn to. it's not as frequent that I turn to Thucydides or Mary Shelley or Daniel Defoe. In fact, it was the first time I had read the Journal of the Plague Year. I knew Robinson Crusoe, of course, but not this novel. And of course, I would often turn in my life to Marcus Aurelius. And so as I read, as I passed out lunches, as I cleaned floors, as I read some more, as I took notes, connections began to be made between what these earlier writers and what I were dealing with, and how they thought about these experiences. I had a hard time thinking about our lockdown. I had a hard time thinking about the politics of the pandemic, and not just the pandemic. As you, of course, know, it was extremely odd to be in a country where we had a leader who refused to take the pandemic seriously. And that was something that I confronted on a daily basis, because all of the rooms had flat screens, and every afternoon, nearly all the flat screens were tuned into our president's afternoon press conference, and it made for a surreal experience. And so that's a bit of what I was trying to do with both my experiences and with the books that I was reading.
That's really interesting. I think, turning to philosophy is a really wholesome way of dealing with the pandemic. I think in the UK there's lots of alcohol sales went up.
Oh, I did that too.
I
But
was
apparently your prime minister was doing that as well.
exactly, yeah. In Downing Street, yeah, that there was
Yes.
definitely booze. But I think you go through 5 accounts of plague and I suppose of pandemic, from Athens to the Great Plague of London, and the philosophers' accounts of these. What resonates, I suppose, with you the most, but also with our pandemic the most? And I suppose, who's your favorite? Who brought you the most comfort? I don't know if that's a really, really difficult question. I just, as
It
I
is
was,
a difficult question,
yeah,
because each of the writers brought something peculiar to their worldview. And at different times, I found different writers spoke to me more loudly, more insistently than the other writers. But I suppose that of all of the writers, the one who gave me the greatest comfort was Camus. Perhaps because I've spent so much time reading and writing on Camus. But one of the things I discovered is that over the course of this pandemic, the Camus that I thought I knew, in fact, I didn't really know. At first, with the pandemic, the epidemiological pandemic, his novel, The Plague, seemed to anticipate in uncanny ways our own responses to the arrival and then the settling of our plague in our lives. And I was especially attracted to the ethic of caring that we find in The Plague. An ethic that's practiced by this motley crew of individuals who find themselves all in Oran, the city where the plague arrives, and join forces in order to resist it. And I actually taught The Plague in the fall of 2020, and I taught it on campus. They allowed hybrid classes at U of H, and I managed to teach one of those classes on campus, and it was an odd experience because the campus was closed. But I would meet with a half dozen students, mostly outdoors and masked, where we would discuss the books that I went on to write about in the class. I went on to write about in the book, and of all of the authors that we read, the students responded so much more viscerally and immediately to Camus because they saw their lives reflected in this novel. And they too found this ethic of caring so very compelling. But this is what's interesting, and this is why Camus now strikes me in a new and really in a troubling way. Because, as you know, and I'm sure as many of the viewers know, the plague in the novel is allegorical. Yes, they're dealing with this explosion of the bubonic plague in the French-Algerian city of Oran sometime in the 1940s. But as Camus made explicit, what was first on his mind in writing this novel was the response of the French to the occupation of their country by Nazi Germany. And it's easy to forget about that because Camus allows us to forget that. He is focused on this ethic of caring in the plague. But as he knew, because he was a member of the resistance, is that it wasn't merely an ethic of caring practiced by resistance by resistance fighters. Guys, thank you. Rosie, thank you. I'm sorry. There was the postman was at the door. And she's 15 years old and she's deaf. And so she's, Rosie, stop, thank you. And so, but what the resistance had to confront was a very different kind of question, not saving lives, but also taking lives. That at times violence was necessary. And I couldn't help but think about that aspect in a new way because, as we all know, about 2 months ago, the very same plague that struck France in 1940 is now striking Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they have to deal with the very same questions that Camus, when in the resistance, confronted. When is violence justified? And so the question for me is, in what ways would Camus have responded to what's taking place in Ukraine today? If he could, what advice would he give to Ukrainians? And for that, rather than turning to the plague, the works that you should really turn to are The Rebel and his letters to a German friend, and to his play, The Just Assassins, because there, in a far more explicit fashion, he takes up both the necessity of violence at times, but at all times, violence is always inexcusable. This is the tension that he tries to maintain in his philosophical essays.
That's fascinating. I wonder if you would expand on the ethic of caring and what that means, and also at the end of the book you talk about how we are all the first and last man, and particularly referencing his unfinished novel, The First Man, because he was obviously killed while he was writing it. Why did you invoke that particular why are we all the first and last man, and also the ethic of caring, I think, are 2 points that it would be really interesting to explore further.
Um, well, to answer the second question first, the reason I focused on the first man and the last man is because I'm very glib. And suddenly to have a conclusion that tries to bring these two together at least made organizational sense. But then I was forced to think about it a bit. And have you read Mary Shelley's The Last Man?
I
Lottie?
haven't, no.
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 Most people haven't. Of course, Mary Shelley will always be the author of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
But The Last Man, which she wrote about a half dozen years later, is a fascinating novel. It's not quite as gripping and not nearly as gothic as Frankenstein, but it's well worth a read. And by The Last Man, she means both herself as well as the narrator of the novel. When Mary Shelley began to write the novel, she had just returned to Great Britain after about a half dozen years on the continent, where she had been with Percy Bysshe Shelley, with Lord Byron, sort of moving from place to place. But with the death of Shelley in that storm, when he was boating in the storm off the coast of Greece, she was forced to return to Great Britain, and she did so with her one surviving child. And she was shunned, she was isolated, she wasn't welcomed, even by her father, William Godwin. And in her journal, she wrote that she felt like the last man. And then she decided to heave this experience of isolation, of exile, of grief, of death, into this novel. And she did so by creating a plague that consumes all of humankind except the narrator. His name is Lionel Verney. And one of the questions that Verney repeatedly poses in the novel is, what is the importance, the value, the meaning of art if there's nobody there to read it, to hear it, to view it? And what if there's nobody there with whom to share it? And it is a desolate novel. It's one that leaves the reader, or at least left me, in a place of some despair. And yet it addresses, or at least it poses these questions, not that she answers them, that's not the point of literature, but she does pose these questions about why we create, why do we write, to what ends, what does it provide the narrator, Lionel Verney, in this novel? And then I couldn't help but think, if only because of the resonance between the titles of Camus' last unfinished novel, as you mentioned, The First Man. And this is a novel that Camus took up towards the end of his life, though he didn't realize it was towards the end of his life. Yeah. And in it, he attempts to not only heave his own experience into shape, as Shelley does in The Last Man, but he does so from a very different perspective. He casts himself as the first man, more or less, because he's imbued with this conviction that he can make of himself what he wishes. But at the very same time, he refuses to surrender the place where he was born, namely France, Algeria. And so on the one hand, it is this ravishing recreation of his childhood and his youth in Algiers. But on the other hand, it is this work where, and I might I should also mention that Camus had been suffering from writer's block the better part of the 1950s. And so with the writing of this novel, or the beginning of the writing, he felt as if he had been reborn. And so too was his faith in literature reborn. And that just throbs in the novel. And so I thought that both of these experiences that Shelley and Camus in the Last Man and the First Man give voice to in their novels, more or less portrays or reflects the tension that so many of us felt and continue to feel, I suspect, over the course of this pandemic that will not come to an end, though we pretend that it has. So that's why I finished with those two works.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I'm skipping around a bit here, but I think I really wanted to touch on the way that you speak about the stories of the residents. I found incredibly moving, and also, you know, quite funny. You know, there's you dress up as the Easter Bunny, which I'd love to have been there.
I can send you a photograph.
Yeah, great. You dress up as the Easter Bunny on Easter Sunday for the residents, and you know you talk in comically, but also often it's very sad and moving, the loneliness that you describe of these people, and how they kind of you're like you kind of living amongst them. And particularly, there's one scenario where you have Mrs. J and Mrs. F, two residents who find the other's television too loud, but have to somehow coexist, and you're trying to navigate and kind of, you know, be the diplomat between them. And you compare this as a sort of like in a Homeric narrative, and I mean that's a really, really creative connection. And you talk about this situation is steeped in status, and I just think I'd love you to speak to that, and particularly I guess the kind of the former part of the book, and how you talk about Homer and the Iliad, and weave that in. I think that would be really interesting.
Well, these two residents had been roommates for, I had been told, for a number of years. But they, I think, began to discover just who the other was because of their enforced isolation together in this room. Once again, residents were not only allowed, were not only prevented from going to the dining hall, they couldn't even gather in the hallways. And so, for example, the activities director would attempt to hold bingo games with all the residents at the thresholds of their rooms down these very long corridors, while she would walk up and down masked, calling out numbers. And it was difficult because a number of the residents either suffered from Alzheimer's or dementia, or were in an early phase of one of those two, and they would always forget the rules. They would take off masks, they would begin to wander along the hallways. And so for the activities director, it was a little bit like rounding up kittens. It was always very difficult. But in the case of these two residents, what was striking is that they discovered what the other's politics, and I guess the other's values were. Or perhaps they already knew. It's just that it was never an issue until they were locked up with one another. And so one would watch Fox News, the other would watch CNN. One could not stand our president. The other was very attached to our president. And so it was expressed in a battle over the remote controls and the volume control. And I was never trained for this kind of work. And I simply, I did my best to serve as an honest broker between the two, but without great success, I suspect. And I couldn't help but, well, I guess I could have helped by framing this in the work of, say, a Thucydides or a Homer. But it seemed that these writers, in part because in both of their cases, their worldview is fundamentally tragic, I thought that they would help me, I guess, make sense of what was taking place in that one room with the two flat screens. Not that either of them could offer advice or a practical lesson as to what I should do should another situation like that arise. But it gave me a kind of comfort that what was taking place in this room with these two, very likable human beings who suddenly did not like one another, it simply wasn't anything new under the sun. It was something that's been with us for a very, very long time.
Brilliant. I'm going to move on to questions because we've got quite a few. And so, firstly, from Alex, please speak to the connection between illness and existential empowerment. Camus writes of the ill-fated Sisyphus that we must imagine him happy as he absurdly pushes the boulder up the hill. How does his story apply to all of us in this absurd time of pandemic and pervasive military violence? What are our possibilities for happiness and existential empowerment? Thank you. That's quite a big question.
It's a huge question. Thank you, Alex. It's a question that I've thought about. I don't have a very good answer, but this is what I have so far. Camus does ask us to imagine Sisyphus happy in this punishment that's been inflicted upon him by the gods of rolling the boulder up the side of a mountain only to watch it roll back down. And he has no choice but to retrieve it and push it back up the mountainside for the same thing to again happen. And he's condemned to do this through all of time. There are two ways of approaching this. I mean, there are thousands of ways, but I have two ways that one might approach it. First, what's fascinating in Camus' retelling of the myth of Sisyphus is that he focuses on what he calls the pause. After Sisyphus reaches the summit, only to see the boulder begin to roll back down the slope, he pauses. And it's in that pause that we discover the character of Sisyphus, Camus tells us. And it's during that pause that we see somebody, we see a character that has decided to make, in part, this task his own, but more importantly, in this pause, and this is my reading of Camus, that the pause allows him to reflect on his past, on his life. And it was a life that was full for Sisyphus. He was, and this is part of Sisyphus, of Camus' portrait of Sisyphus. He loved the world. He loved the material, palpable things of the world. He loved the beach. He loved the ocean. He loved the blue sky of Greece. He loved his wife. He was a sensualist. He didn't want to die. And he cheats the gods several times out of death. And so once the punishment is placed upon Sisyphus, he uses this pause to look back on what he had done, and he finds that it's good, that he has no regrets, that he can embrace what it is he had lived. But there's another way of going about it, and I think this is the way that Camus went about it. We have to keep in mind that the myth of Sisyphus is one of the works in Camus' first cycle of works, what he called the cycle of the absurd, a cycle that contains the myth of Sisyphus, the stranger, and Caligula, the play. But while he himself was confronting the Nazi plague in occupied France in 1942-43, he wrote in his journal that he had come to realize that absurdity teaches nothing, that he had to rethink his philosophy. And rather than adopting the kind of the scornful self-containment of a Sisyphus, instead, and this is where the ethic of care comes in, and I didn't get to this question before, I'm sorry, Lottie, but in fact, in response to the absurd nature of our world, rather than looking to Sisyphus, we look to one another. Mm. And this is the message. It's more complicated than this. The way that I've just expressed it smacks of, I guess, a kind of hallmark sentimentality, but this is not at all what's taking place in his works. But in various ways, in The Just Assassins and The Rebel and The Plague, which are the three works that constitute his cycle of rebellion, his second cycle of literature, of works, he urges himself to look at others. And it's only when you turn to others that you discover who you are. And so there's this famous pseudo-Cartesian formula in The Rebel, namely, I resist, therefore we are. And I think we found that expression in so many ways during the first pandemic. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what strikes me is the ways in which Ukrainians, from what I can tell, and like you, I can tell this only through our media, seem to have discovered one another, a nation that apparently had not fully embraced being Ukrainian and being united, suddenly in the face of this ideological plague, Putinism, resisted, and in that act of resistance, they discovered that they are, as Ukrainians, as human beings. It's quite extraordinary what's happening there. And so I think Camus might ask us to look at the second cycle of works. Now, just one last thing in response to Alex. Camus wasn't all that convinced that we can be happy. When you ask about the possibilities for happiness, there are no happy characters in The Plague, the novel, but there are characters who lead extraordinarily meaningful lives because collectively they resist the plague. And so to tweak a little bit the conclusion of the myth of Sisyphus, in the plague, we must imagine all of those characters not happy, but as having lived meaningful lives. And so that's the best I can do right now. I know there are lots of other questions. And so
No, I think that's great, and I think it follows on to the next question, which is asked by Mark Carrigan. You said earlier that we pretend the pandemic is over when it really isn't. Is there any insight you can offer about the peculiar experience of recognizing a real and present danger that is now widely ignored across society? I think that's very true of COVID-19, but also I've noticed that actually Ukraine and Russia, certainly in British media, is not necessarily every day the front news anymore. And I think if you can speak to that, I think that would be interesting.
I can offer the insight of some of the writers, Mark, that I discuss in the book. If we go back as far as Thucydides and his account of the Great Plague of Athens in 430, 429 BCE, he gives it pride of place, and he's right to do so, in part because in historical terms, though his account of the plague only covers about a half dozen or so pages in my English translation. I don't read Greek. The actual impact of the plague, and Thucydides is aware of this because he was there. He actually was one of the Athenian generals. It's because he failed in a mission as a general that he was exiled from Athens for 20 years. And the plague had such a dramatic impact upon Athens' ability to carry on the war against Sparta in the Peloponnesian League. So much so that there are contemporary historians, contemporary classicists, who believe that the plague and not the Spartans were the reason for Athens' eventual defeat in 404 BCE. Now, one of the other reasons why Thucydides, to my mind, gives it such prominence in his account is that the response of Athenians to the plague, we never knew, based on the symptoms he describes, what disease he in fact was discussing. And there was a long debate among epidemiologists and historians about the disease. But based on a mass grave that was found a decade or two ago in Athens, as they were digging a new subway line, they tested the bones of the skeletons in that mass grave. It turns out to have been typhus that swept through Athens. And the response to this typhus epidemic in Athens, in so many ways, not just anticipates our response, but also reflects the reason why Thucydides wrote his history, the deep reason. It wasn't just to account for the 27 years of war between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies. Instead, it was in order to present for Thucydides what he thought drove this war, and what drove it was human nature. And he argues that, and in fact, he makes this astounding claim at the beginning of his history, that it is a gift for all time. It may not entertain the way that Homer or Herodotus do, okay? He's very dismissive of those guys. but it is a gift for all time. Why? Not because it's entertaining, but because it gets to the very bone of who we are as human beings. And as such, we are fated to repeat and repeat and repeat what the Athenians did during those decades of war. And for Thucydides, this is a tragic realization, right? That in the end, regardless of how ardently we strive, regardless of how deliberative or reasonable we are, like Pericles, events will always arise that will knock our plans to pieces. That's the case with Pericles. I mean, it's fascinating in the history because it's immediately after Pericles gives his funeral oration, this brilliant expression of the greatness of Athens, a greatness that is based upon Athenian reason, its ability to analyze and anticipate. Right after that speech, what does Thucydides do? He pivots to the epidemic, the plague that strikes Athens, and Pericles dies in it. How ironic, how tragic. And so the short answer, Mark, I'm sorry I've gone on much too long, is that here's the insight. And it's an insight, by the way, of Camus at the end of the plague. And Camus was reading Thucydides as he was drafting the plague. And at the very end of that novel, the narrator reminds the reader that the plague had just lifted from the city and people are celebrating. And he says to himself, he says to us, his readers, let them celebrate while they have time, because the plague never dies. It only lies dormant. And one day it will reappear by first calling upon the rats to surge into the streets of our city. And so I wish I could offer something more comforting. I can't, at least not just yet.
I think honesty is your honesty is great. Thank you. And we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got a few questions and also a comment from Jane in the chat, who would like you to expand slightly on what the absurd actually is, and what Camus is actually saying about the myth. I know your book doesn't cover that work particularly, but if you could just shortly explain what the absurd is and how you understand the absurd.
Well, for Camus, the absurd is not something that is out there in the world, Jane. The absurd occurs when there's a convergence, according to Camus, and he describes this in various ways in The Myth of Sisyphus, which is his first of two philosophical essays. And the absurd, he writes in this early essay, we have to keep in mind that when Camus wrote this essay, started writing it in the second half of the 1930s, he's a 20-something. He's a 20-something who is trying to come to grips with all of these absurdities in his life. The fact that at the age of 1, he loses his father in the First World War. He never knew his father. He loses his father in the most absurd of wars. He's trying to deal with the absurdity of growing up in a household where his mother and his grandmother and his uncle were all illiterate, and where his uncle and his mother were deaf and partly mute. He's wrestling with the absurdity when at the age of 17, he begins to cough up blood and discovers he has tuberculosis. He's dealing with the absurdity of living in French Algeria, ruled by a republic, informed by the great principles of 1789, but that these principles are extended only as far as the Pied Noir or the colonists living in French Algeria, but not the 10 million or so Arabs and Berbers living there. And so as he gazes at these absurdities, he's also thinking about, is there a deeper level to these social, political, personal absurdities? And he discovers it. The absurd happens when we demand answers from the world, from the skies, and the skies do not answer. They're silent. That is the absurd. It is the meeting of our insatiable thirst for meaning and the ineluctable silence of the world.
Yeah.
And so that's Camusian absurdity, I think.
Yeah. No, that I think that's brilliant explanation. And I think we've probably got time for one more question. And this is from Sage Collins. Although the word wisdom has not come up in the conversation, it is in the title of the talk. That's very true. Given how little wisdom seems to have been on display in most governments, do you have any thoughts on what wise governance, or at a smaller level, wise personal comportment may look like in times of plague or great suffering? Thank you, Sage. I think that's a brilliant
That's
question.
a great question, Sage. And it's an embarrassing question because I can't answer it. First, I didn't put wisdom in the title. Anthony Morgan did. So he's responsible for the word I'm not. There's nothing wise to this, but it's interesting that Albert Camus was a man of the left, but he was a man of, I guess, what we would call the far left. He was most sympathetic to what the French call anarcho-syndicalists, people who place themselves in the tradition of Jean-Pierre Proudhon, the 19th century French political theorist, an archenemy of Karl Marx. And according to Proudhon, an ideal world is a world, or an ideal country is a country that has this federation of worker co-ops. And that each of these co-ops would be governed by the residents of that particular co-op, and that they would create this kind of loose confederation. And Camus was always extremely supportive. He would write for free for the anarcho-syndicalist journals and have interviews with them. Now, I mention this because if you've read the Journal of the Plague Year, Sage, one of the most fascinating sections is when the narrator, HF, recounts a story about two brothers and one of their kinsmen who decide to flee London because that was the only cure. That was the only response to plague, bubonic plague. You run for your life. And the well-to-do were able to leave London, and they left early, okay? But the poor, not so much. But these two brothers and their relative decide they're going to leave. And they succeed in leaving. One is a baker, one is a kind of carpenter, and one is a sailmaker. And over the course of their journey on the roads, where they're shunned by other towns because these other towns believe that these three men are carrying the plague, they begin to gather other people wandering the roads, trying to put some distance between themselves and London. And fairly soon, what you have is this perambulating community, a mobile community, where they move along the roads, they pitch camp where they can, they negotiate with on nearby towns, exchanging foodstuffs for other material goods and the like. And what's extraordinary about this group is that they, in many ways, resemble what Camus thought of as the ideal of anarcho-syndicalism. And it's not for me to say what Defoe was doing with this section, but he was a dissenter. He was extremely skeptical as a dissenter of the powers and of the fairness of Great Britain's government. And it's just by reading this section, you realize, at least I did, that Defoe is injecting this segment with something that is so close to his heart that, who knows, perhaps this is the kind of response where you fall back on smaller communities. We've done that over the course of the last 2 years, virtual communities. But there might be something there, but that's the very best I can do, especially as I look at the clock and
Yeah. No, thank you. And yeah, thank you, Professor Robert Zaretsky, for speaking with me and talking about your brilliant book. Do buy Victories Never Last. It comes out next month. You can pre-order it now. I think Anthony has put the link in the chat. And also, again, if you enjoy these series, then do sign up to receive The Philosopher. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for coming along. Thank you again, Anthony, for having me, and Rob. Thank you.
thank you, Lottie. I really enjoyed it.